Between the two world wars, the six Mitford sisters were the it girls of English society. The beautiful and eccentric debutantes had lives most of us can only imagine. But two of the sisters threw all of that away, becoming loyal followers of dark political movements of the time.
At the outset, they found themselves to be fixtures on the society pages, but as time went on, they were fixtures in the headlines for very different reasons.
Historical novelist Marie Benedict's book, The Mitford Affair, is a fascinating fictional account of the controversial decisions made by sisters Unity and Diana. All the while, Nancy Mitford, a well-known novelist herself, observes and recounts her sisters' disturbing allegiances. Marie Benedict's book, The Mitford Affair, is available at the Novel Neighbor. So Marie Benedict, it's great to have you here today to talk about the Mitford Affair.
I'm so thrilled to be here talking to you guys.
The Mitford sisters are such interesting people, real characters. You write historical novels, so your novels are based on real people. Will you tell us a little bit about the Mitford sisters?
Well, they're hard to encapsulate because there's six of them, and each one was more brilliant, beautiful, eccentric than the next. You know, they really, together, they were sort of the aristocratic it girls in Great Britain in the 1920s and 30s. And at the outset, they found themselves to be fixtures on the society pages. But as time went on, they were fixtures in the headlines for very different reasons.
They came of age and were living in such interesting times in Great Britain between the two world wars. And there was a lot of things looming at that particular time. And they got very involved politically, a couple of the sisters.
Yes, several of the sisters, and taking very different positions, which is really interesting. So just to put a little bit of it in context, when I think, and I think a lot of people, when they think about the interwar period, you know, that really crucial segment between World War I and World War II, we think of, you know, the continent of Europe as struggling between fascism and communism. You know, there's these powerhouses like Nazi Germany and Mussolini in Italy and in Spain, where fascism is really taking hold. And then, of course, communism is really becoming a force. But we don't really think about it taking such hold in Great Britain, or at least I didn't until I dove into the research for this book. And I realized that the Mitford sisters, though sort of not terribly political, at least some of them, at the beginning of this time period, as the years progress, they become swept up in these movements, communism and fascism, that are gaining strength in Great Britain. And they start to then not just be swept up in it, but sweep it up themselves. They start to really become forces in both of those movements. So it was fascinating and horrible at once to watch.
Yeah, it is so fascinating. And your book is from the point of view of three of the sisters who are very unique and so different from one another: Nancy, Unity, and Diana.
That's right. So there were six sisters, as I mentioned, and I kind of winnowed it down to three because I wanted to really focus in on the way in which these three sisters in particular, well, two of the three sisters, became really almost like the first and second ladies of fascism in Great Britain, and then Nazism, and the situation that put the third sister, Nancy, in. And just to kind of back up a second, when our book opens, and this is, I don't think, a spoiler because it's really from page one, the sisters are sort of in their prime of their social life, right? They're the bright young things of Great Britain. The fourth sister down, Unity, is being hosted to a great ball at her sister Diana's, one of her many homes. Diana is married to the heir to the Guinness beer fortune. And yet, looming on the scene is the threat of fascism in the form of Sir Oswald Mosley. He is the head of the British Union of Fascists, and Diana has fallen desperately in love with him. And she's one of the sisters who wasn't terribly political. And yet, as she becomes obsessed with the man, she becomes obsessed with the movement. And she tries to bring her sisters along for the ride. Now, one of the sisters, Unity, is happy to go along for the ride because Unity, the fourth sister down, probably the most peculiar of the sisters. They're each beautiful and brilliant in their own way and social creatures. But Unity's, just to put it this way, she brings her pet rat and pet snake with her to balls. Right? I mean, here she is. She's got a little rat on her shoulder.
A little quirky.
Right. She's very quirky. And I think, of course I write fiction, so I'm inspired by the real character. I really feel like she was trying to find her place among this glittering group of sisters. And from a young age, from her teenage years, she decides that fascism is going to become her thing. Now, when I started to read this, I'm like, a teenage girl, into fascism? Oh, we're talking like 14. And when I put it in the context of what was happening, not just in continental Europe, but in England at the time, I could see there actually was a rather large faction of the population who believed in fascism. But just to show you how it was playing out in their own house, Unity shared a bedroom with the next sister down, Jessica, who's not one of our three main characters, but she does figure kind of prominently in the story. Unity, having, identified with fascism, decides she's going to decorate her side of the bedroom with all the emblems of fascism, right? She's got the swastika, portraits of Hitler and Mussolini, all this kind of stuff. Jessica is, rightly so, not happy about that and paints a line down the middle of the bedroom. And in response to Unity's proclamation of fascism, she announces that because Unity's a fascist, she's going to become a communist. And she literally decorates her side of the bedroom with, the hammer and sickle and busts of Lenin and Stalin. So that this kind of battle that's playing out in Europe overall is actually playing out in one of the Mitford sister bedrooms. Now, back to our story, when it opens in 1932, it gives you a sense of how ripe Unity is to kind of jump 2 feet in, 100% enthusiastic alongside Diana to become part of Sir Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists.
So you're right that Diana falls head over heels and really throws her lot in with Oswald Mosley.
Yeah.
Why do you think that was?
Well, that's something I struggled with because, to be honest, here she was in many ways this very idyllic marriage. Not only was Brian Guinness fabulously wealthy, he was strikingly handsome. He was absolutely enamored of her. And in many ways, he was considered kind of the catch of the season, and they married at 18. The two of them become luminaries in the English social scene. They have 2 young children. I honestly think Diana, who was considered the most beautiful girl of her generation, she was extremely bright, I think she was bored. I think there was nothing challenging about this life that she had found herself in. I mean, I think most people could have probably made do, figured it out. And Mosley, more than anyone she had met, challenged her. First of all, he was married, right? He wasn't going to give up his wife for her. He was this charismatic leader of this movement that she felt might be the future of Great Britain. And there was a challenge, there was a role for her in that context. And so I think those things really played a huge role in her being so attracted to this man and so swept up in his belief systems that she would actually leave her own husband, which of course was really not done at that time. It was well known she was leaving him, divorcing him for a married man. She was just setting herself up to be Oswald Mosley's mistress, and she had 2 children. And scandal aside, she just went for it. And so it was really a shocking move and one that she never wavered on, not in any of the decades that followed.
And there were many decades. She lived a while.
Many decades, many scandal-ridden decades that followed, yeah.
And then there's Unity, who really is part of Hitler's inside circle at some point.
Right, because what happens is she sees Diana stepping into this role at Mosley's side, unofficially, the first lady of fascism, because of course he has a wife that he won't leave. But Unity sees this happen, and at first she's all in too. She's at the rallies. They even get Nancy at one point, the eldest sister who's a novelist, to join in, although she quickly kind of sees through it. But Unity, I think, Unity always had this desire to stand out, to make her own mark. And I think once Diana really sort of threw her lot in with fascism, it wasn't just Unity's thing anymore. And I almost feel like she wanted to take it up a notch. And so what she does is she decamps to Munich. This was her story. She told her parents that she was going to go to finishing school in Munich and learn German. And that is what she did do, but the reality is she rarely went to her German classes, and instead she embarked on this plan to stalk Adolf Hitler. And it's just like mind-boggling to look back and think about it. Here she was, this teenage girl, so willful, so unusual, finds out Adolf Hitler's daily schedule when he's in Munich, where he has lunch, where he has his afternoon coffee, what times he walks around a particular park or square. And she puts herself in his path day after day after day, multiple times a day, until he invites her over for lunch. I mean, to me, if I were Adolf Hitler, I would think I would get rid of this woman, right? It would seem. But you know what? There was something very attractive about Unity. She was an aristocratic British girl who was cousins with Winston Churchill. Now, Winston Churchill was not the prime minister at this time. He was out of power because he was banging the drums, trying to get everyone's attention about the threat of the Nazis, right? He had at once been in power. And Great Britain was really following a political path of appeasement at that time towards Hitler and his machinations. So, for him, if he could show the world that Churchill's cousin, this attractive, aristocratic English girl, was an adherent of Nazism, then what's there to be scared of, right? And so he featured her on newspapers. He had her at his side at rallies, at the Olympics. But she wasn't alone, because very soon there was Diana. Diana saw that getting in there, exploiting Unity's relationship, not just with Hitler, but really the whole inner circle who she became close with, was a way for Diana to forge an alliance with the Nazis on Mosley's behalf for the British Union of Fascists. And so off she trots to Germany, telling everyone she's just going to keep an eye on Unity, which is something she never felt particularly compelled to do beforehand. And suddenly it's not just Unity in the newspaper articles, it's Diana too. And Diana's there in the inner circle as well.
As a historical novelist, you have to kind of imagine conversations. They're not necessarily recorded for you. You have a lot of facts to base them on. So how hard was it to write dialogue for Hitler?
Oh gosh, so hard. Those whole scenes, because he is a character in the book. I mean, if you would have told me I was going to write a book where Hitler was a character, I would have said absolutely not. But I became so intrigued by the question of how these well-heeled, pedigreed young women who had every advantage got swept up in the inner circle of Nazism. Even though they didn't have the benefit that we have today of hindsight, I just couldn't get my head around it. And so I dug deeper and deeper trying to figure it out. And in order to get in those scenes, which was very difficult and different from each of the perspectives, it was different to envision a scene with Unity and Hitler as it was Diana and Hitler, because they came at that relationship with him through very different means and for very different motivations. Diana was there to exploit that relationship to get something for Mosley. Unity was literally just enthralled, literally, and was thinking about how it could help forge her own identity. And the best way that I could do it was to use their letters as the primary source. I spend a lot of time gathering and immersing myself in the original source material for the women I write about. So in this case, sometimes I write about a lot of unknown women, and sometimes there's no materials. There's a few letters or a few secondary accounts. With the Mitfords, there's an abundance, sometimes an overabundance of material. I mean, these sisters, with the exception of Unity, they all wrote their own autobiographies. But the thing that was most helpful to get inside their heads and write those scenes and tolerate it, writing about Hitler, was to use the letters. And these sisters were prolific letter writers. There's so many letters between them that actually describe their interactions with Hitler. the way he talked to them, the phrases he used, the places they went, how he treated them, how they saw him. And that was how I was able to do it.
You know, we know how evil Hitler was, but yet you had to write him as a character who came alive and was perhaps charismatic, but yet you know the level of evil. How did you do that?
It was very hard for me to write him in a light such that he was appealing to these characters. Unity, in particular, was very prone to writing back home about Hitler, about the dinners and the teas, and they would go to the opera together, and Unity loved the opera. And so I got to see the side that he crafted for her to see. I mean, he was evil in every possible way, but he was also somehow managed to conjure up some charismatic component to compel people to follow him. And he turned that quality on in droves with the sisters and their parents also, who went over to visit with them. And so I really leaned on those letters, not just the words they used, but the descriptions of the scenes, the tone, the way that they came away from those meetings with him, almost like swooning. And that was the only way I could do it. I will say, too, I do it for two reasons. There are three storylines in the book. One is Nancy, and that's told in the first person. Diana and Unity are told in the third person. And the reason for that is because I could only get so close to them. I couldn't write it. I could not write those chapters in the first person.
That would have been too close to having to get into their actual thoughts about what they were doing.
Right.
Which are sort of unthinkable in some ways.
And I needed to understand them, but not assume them. And so it was a line I could not cross. But yeah, those letters, I could never have conjured those scenes up myself. Let's put it that way.
As you read the book, you realize that these women have no idea what the future holds. You know, we look at this in retrospect and we go, no, don't do that. You don't know what this awful, awful situation is and what people are looking away from. You know, and there's even a few intimations and sections where you mention that. You know, Unity goes and moves into an apartment and is told the Jewish family won't need it anymore. It's very chilling.
Very chilling.
Right. But, you know, it's really interesting writerly, I think, that there's still a lot of suspense. We know what the outcome is, and we know where the whole situation ends up, but we want to know, how did they get there? There's so much. It's a page turner still, even though we know.
I hope so.
I love the book.
And that's the tricky thing too with writing about this time period is that, you know, World War II has been written about extensively, and we don't know every nook and cranny. I in fact kind of think this part of the World War II story is relatively unknown, at least it was to me, and yet that foreknowledge that we have, you know, we can almost anticipate the next scene, and part of us wants to warn the girls against what they're doing. And one of the things I struggled with was, how much do they know, especially about what was going to happen with the Jewish people? Right. Because if they knew, they were tolerating it for their own purposes and turning a blind eye to it. Or is it possible, I asked myself, that they didn't know? Right. And so that was something I really struggled with. And the deeper I kind of got into the material and the access and the kinds of conversations they would have surely overheard, I came to really believe that there was a lot that they did know. And it made their decision making and their actions even more unpalatable.
Those years are really interesting, too, because, you know, England, Great Britain, all of Europe has just come out of World War I. Nobody wants another conflict. And so there's a lot of anti-war sentiment. There's the Depression. It's a time of a great deal of conflict. And you're right, the British Union of Fascists, they really caught on quite a bit. I mean, you don't even really hear a lot about that.
Yeah.
You know, and then when Churchill began to see what was going on in Germany, it was pretty hard to convince people, we've got to get into this.
You know, as Americans, we have been taught or look at World War II through a very specific lens. And in writing this story, I really had to dig in and look at history from that lens, from their lens. And when you do that, you're learning so much more about, I don't want to say the peripheral things, but the things that aren't part of the narrative that we commonly understand about that time period. And when you step back and kind of look at it through that different lens, you can see all these movements percolating. And you can also see how the war could have very easily ended very differently. It's so close. We as Americans don't really even understand that. And the real terror of that threat is it's literally nipping at their heels. You know, when you step back and look, like, this was Hitler's allowing these girls to become part of his inner circle and then using them from propaganda was all part and parcel of a carefully orchestrated plan, not just with these girls, with other British people, of almost creating the red carpet for a vassal state. You know, his plan was to conquer Europe and England and put everything under the Nazi flag. And if there was a group of willing fascists that he was already in league with that had a really strong power base in Great Britain, it would be that much easier. And when you step back and kind of look at it in that context, the stakes become very high and very clear. And when I kind of started to look at these girls and the situation through that lens, it became even more terrifying, to be honest with you, what they were doing.
All of their involvement, everything was with the men, the powerful men. They clung to a powerful man to give them access to places where they could, Unity and Diana in particular, could, express themselves.
Right. I mean, I think these girls, they were raised in a very unusual way, even for the time. They grew up wealthy, although their funds were diminishing. They were titled. Their father had multiple estates, but one by one they were being sold off, and they were living in a series of ever more crumbling English country estates. The parents did not believe in formal education for the girls, so they basically kind of self-educated with the family library, and then they otherwise were left to their own devices. And, you can imagine with a group of really smart 6 sisters and one brother, but, he's kind of a footnote in our story, there's a lot of infighting. There's a lot of factions being formed. They form their own languages that are only taught to a couple of them. They have secret nicknames. And all of those things are forging these sisters, honing them. And then they're kind of let loose in the world. And like you said, what do we do now? Now, Nancy, of course, found an outlet with her writing. When our story opens, she's published, I think it's 3 novels, and she actually publishes 2 novels during the course of the book that are very specifically tied to the war and what her sisters are up to. I don't know that maybe even until my book, or maybe more tangentially, people realized exactly how specifically this was tied to her own sisters and what was going on. But those books are, I think, really her attempt to open up their and others' eyes to the reality of what's going on around them. But the other sisters are kind of cast adrift. What they were told to do is marry well. That was the whole point of being introduced into society, becoming a debutante, which of course they all were. And of course Diana did exactly that. But it was just all too easy. It wasn't challenging. She was very bright. And in many ways, Mosley always held himself back from her. She always had to continuously woo him and become indispensable to him. And so it was a constant challenge. I mean, you hate to think of, that as the necessity for her or her purpose, but in many ways I almost think that's what it was. And then you have poor Unity, who's just adrift. I don't feel too badly for her because she made some terrible choices, but I think the reason that she was motivated towards those choices were kind of tragic reasons in a way, unlike Diana, who very much understood what she was getting into.
And your choice of Nancy as a narrator is great and interesting too, because she, as a writer, is our observer.
Yeah, I toyed with using Jessica actually, or including Jessica in the story because
she's interesting as well.
She's very interesting, and she does feature in the story, and her path juxtaposes with her sisters, because she chooses communism, and a lot of what Jessica did was kind of outside the scope of the time period of the story. She moved to America and became a very well-known journalist and advocate, And that happened well after World War II. So it was unfortunately a little bit outside the scope. But again, a fascinating figure as well.
And you write about fascinating historical women.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to make that a path?
Oh, geez. I guess it's not one that I was on professionally. When I started writing, I was a commercial litigator in New York City, and I had been for a while. I actually did that for over 10 years. But, when I knew it was not what I was meant to be doing, starting in middle school, I really fell in love with this idea that there are parts of history that we don't know and voices that are not shared.
That's very astute and bright in middle school to
Well,
realize
I
that.
read this one book called The Mists of Avalon. I had this wonderful aunt who always gave me fabulous books. And it's actually a fantasy novel, but it's a retelling of the Arthurian legend from the perspective of the women. And it was the first thing I had read like that. I'd never seen that. And it really just opened my eyes to the fact that there were women's stories and perspectives in legend and lore and history. And I started to be very curious about that. And when I went off to college, I became a history major. And I thought misguidedly that there might be some kind of job where I could find these women. Of course, there's not.
There is. You have it now.
Well, yeah, I had to create that job. But, so I kind of got swept up as a history major, swept up in this wave of women who are really being encouraged to go to law school in great numbers for the first time. And I ended up being a lawyer. I was, for better or worse, good at it. And I kind of got stuck there for a while, but I knew it wasn't what I was meant to do. And it took me a while and over time until I kind of found this path of, really circling back to what I was originally passionate about, and kind of finding these women and shining the light on their stories.
Well, a woman that you actually did write a book about is Churchill's wife, Clementine. Clemmy.
Yes, Clemmy. Yeah, she's fabulous. I mean, she was, not the woman behind the man. She was the woman to his side, in front of him, taking him by the hand and leading him to good decisions. She was really his political partner in many ways, from World War I, where he was the Secretary of the Navy, I think, all the way through World War II and the years beyond. And in fact, the Churchills is kind of crazy. The Churchills I had known about the Mitfords reading Nancy's novels when I was younger, but I kind of got interested in them again, actually doing the research for Clementine Churchill. And I kept on coming across the Mitfords because Clementine Churchill and David Mitford, the Mitfords' father, were first cousins. And because of that relationship, they were together a great deal. Holidays, celebrations, weekends at Chartwell, weekends at whatever estate the Mitfords happened to be living in. And some of their children were like best friends. So they figured really prominently. And then, of course, Churchill himself and Clementine, to a lesser extent, feature in my book as well. Because when a lot of these things that Diana, and Unity are starting to engage in are becoming apparent, of course, Winston is aware of it as well.
Well, such a fascinating book. Marie Benedict, it's great to have you here talking about the Mitford Affair.
Thank you so much.